My name is Kevin Shunk, and I work for the City of Austin, the Watershed Protection Department, and I'm the city's floodplain administrator, which is basically a way of saying my job really is twofold. My group reviews any development application for someone who wants to build something in a floodplain in the City of Austin. And then I also am in charge of the city's flood warning system. So it's basically the two hats that I wear in the city. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is more on the permitting side of things, and what's called one of our floodplain rules. It's called substantial damage. When you checked in in the room over here, when you got here today, they should have informed you whether the City of Austin has determined that your property was substantially damaged from the Halloween storms. And if it was, they should have given you a letter. It's actually the same letter. The first page is English and the second letter is in Spanish. And I'll just refer to this. I call it the generic substantial damage letter. Today, we sent out specific letters to each property owner that have information specific to your property. So if you looked on the letter down here at the bottom where it talks about depth of flooding and the value of the home, the letter that you would get in the mail if you're substantially damaged will have specific values for your property there. It won't be blank like it is here. But in general, it will have the same information that's in this letter. And I'm going to talk about what the letter is and what it means so you can try to understand exactly how we came to a determination of substantial damage. If your property was not substantially damaged, we are also sending letters to those property owners as well. The reason for that is there are cases where a next door neighbor, one could be substantial and the other not substantial, and we didn't want the not substantial person to think, well, I didn't get a letter, maybe it got lost, I don't know if I'm substantial or not. So we sent out substantial damage letters and we sent out non-substantial letters for all the homes that essentially the city had inspected after the flood. So before I get into the specifics of the letter and the substantial damage, I want to talk a little bit about the city's floodplain regulations. The City of Austin participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a program that's run by FEMA, federal government. And the flood insurance program provides benefits to the community. One of those benefits is it allows anybody in the City of Austin, whether you live in the floodplain or you don't live in the floodplain, it doesn't matter, but anybody in the City of Austin can purchase flood insurance through the federal government. Now, flood insurance from the federal government is much cheaper than it would be if you purchased flood insurance on the private market, which is one of the benefits of the program itself. There are lots of other benefits to being in the NFIP. That's one of them. Another one is that for communities in the United States that participate in the flood insurance program, they're eligible for disaster declaration funding and a lot of other things. But in essence, it's an insurance program. And so the program identifies flood risks in a community, and then based upon those risks, FEMA provides flood insurance to those people who wish to purchase it. To participate in the flood insurance program, FEMA requires the community to adopt and enforce a minimum set of rules. And we call those the minimum standards. So FEMA will say, well, if you're going to be in the National Flood Insurance Program, you have to adopt, and they're very specific and written, these minimum rules. Now, a community can adopt rules that are stronger than those, and what we call those, higher than the minimum standards, a higher standard. And the City of Austin does that in some cases. Lots of communities throughout the nation do that. FEMA's minimum standards they're just that. They're, in a floodplain manager's opinion, they're very basic. And for the flood risks that we have here in the City of Austin, we feel that it's important to provide further protection to our citizens. And so ever since we entered the program in 1981, our regulations have been stronger than FEMA's, and they continue to be. So one of those floodplain management regulations is what we call the substantial damage rule. The substantial damage rule actually is a minimum standard. So the rule that the city uses for substantial damage is the exact same as FEMA's minimum standard. And the substantial damage rule states that if a property sustains damage from a disaster, that could be from a flood, it could be from a fire, hurricane, tornado, any disaster, and the cost to bring that structure back to its pre-disaster condition, if that cost is greater than 50% of the value of the structure, then the substantial damage rule says that the owner has to now make sure that that building complies with the floodplain rules of the community. The reason for that from FEMA's side is if a property is damaged to that extent, then it's best for the program, the flood insurance program, and the people who own the house to reduce the flood risk. Let's reduce, if it complied at one time when it was built, and then over the years floodplains have changed and now it doesn't comply, then once the disaster comes and it's determined to be substantially damaged, let's bring it into compliance with the floodplain rules and therefore minimize the flood risk to that house in the future. That's the general purpose of the substantial damage rule. In order to come up with which property sustained substantial damage, the city had to gather lots of information. And there's basically 3 key points to determine substantial damage. And those are listed in the letter, but I'll talk about those 3 here. The first one is the depth of flooding in the house. The second is the value of the structure itself. And when we talk about value of the structure, we're not including the value of the land that the structure is on. It's just the structure, the building's value itself.
At fair market price?
Right.
At fair market value?
Yes.
Pre-flood?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
The third is the value of the improvements to bring it back to its pre-disaster condition. So let's talk about those 3 a little more in detail. Depth of flooding. So after the flood, lots of city departments were involved in doing some surveys through the community to assess the level of damage. And our co-compliance department had lots of people going out to do damage surveys. They actually did 2 different surveys on 2 different dates. And each time they went around, they would note how high the water depth was in the houses that they were inspecting. And we got all that information, the Watershed Protection Department. In addition, the Red Cross came down and they did damage surveys and we got their information. FEMA came down and did surveys. We have their information. And then engineers from the division that I work in, which is the Watershed Engineering Division, we did some surveys as well and we gathered information. Now, in addition to our staff doing tours through the neighborhood, we also looked at what we call high water marks. High water mark is a mark on a building or maybe a leaf line on the ground where we can see how high the water got in this area. And then we can use either survey equipment, in some cases we did, or we can use some topographic information at the office to determine how high the water was in this general area. And then we can use that information with all the topography we have in the city to make some general assumptions about how high the water was. And so, say for example, one of the damage surveys says the depth of flooding in a house was 2 inches, and another damage survey says the depth of flooding in a house was 4 feet. Well, obviously those are drastically different, but then when we look at the high water mark information and we can see, well, in this area of the neighborhood, the water was 3 to 4 feet deep, then the 2-inch mark, for whatever reason, we can tell was not a relevant number. So that's how we use some of the surveys that our staff did as well. So that's how we came up with the depth of flooding in the house. The second value is the home value. And again, that's the value of the structure, and it doesn't include the value of the land. And we determined home value looking at 2 different numbers. The first number we looked at was the 2013 Travis County Appraisal District improvement value. Now, if you look on your tax bill or you look on the TCAD website, they separate the cost into land value, and they call it the improvement value. I call improvement. When I'm saying improvements here, I'm saying construction, but they call it the improvement value means the value of the structure. So we used the 2013 TCAD improvement value, And then when we're talking about the lower Onion Creek area, the William Cannon, Pleasant Valley area, the city of Austin has been doing a lot of buyouts in that neighborhood for years. And did some even right up to the time of the flood, where it's a current program, so we're doing appraisals a lot. And we used that appraisal data to come up with market value for homes in that area. For the Pinehurst area, which is a little further upstream, we also did a market analysis for those houses. So it wasn't just TCAD data. We looked at a market analysis for those houses as well. And for the value of the home, we used the higher of those two numbers, either the market analysis or the TCAD data. In almost all cases, the market analysis is higher. But there were a very few cases where the appraisal district value was higher, but there were not very many of those. So that gave us the value of the structure itself. The third number is the value of improvements. And when I say improvements, I mean to bring the home back to its pre-disaster condition. In the city of Austin, we have a department called the Neighborhood Housing and Community Development Department. And they just so happen to own a house in the neighborhood. They own houses all across the city. And they repair their houses and build houses quite often. So they have on their staff, they have contractors that build houses. That's their job, their city staff. So we worked with that group to come up with how much it would cost to repair homes based upon a varying degree of flood depths. So we would say, okay, if a house was flooded with 6 inches of water, then what sort of things would have to be replaced? And our contractors would with their experience would say, well, you're going to do this much wall board, and you're going to do baseboards, and they came up with a per square foot cost for 6 inches of flooding. And then we increased it to say, well, what if it's 1 to 3 feet of flooding? Obviously, it's going to be a little more damage, and then how much would that be per square foot? And then we just did another step up, and then until we got to a point where we got max flooding was about 6 feet. So it was a varying degree of improvements. Now, the information that they used to come up with these costs, with the improvement costs, were based upon current labor and materials costs within the city of Austin. It's all local information. It wasn't a general United States database, it was all local data. So that gave us a value of the improvements, how much it would cost to bring it up to a pre-flood condition, depending on how much the depth was. So then we compare the value of the structure and the value of the improvements. And if the improvement value is 50% or more than the value of the structure, then that structure is determined to be substantially damaged. Now, like I said before, once a property is determined to be substantially damaged, it has to be in compliance with the floodplain rules. And I'll talk a little bit about the floodplain rules. I will be perfectly honest with you, the floodplain rules are extensive and they're complex. So I broke it down basically into 3 main rules that I'll talk about. One of those is called freeboard. The second one is called safe access. And the third one is called no adverse impact. Let's talk about freeboard. Freeboard is a height above which you have to build your home above the 100-year floodplain. So when we talk about building your home, we're talking about what we call the finished floor elevation. And that's essentially the elevation of where you step into the house. So in the city of Austin, the finished floor elevation of a home has to be a minimum of 1 foot above the 100-year floodplain elevation. And we recommend people to go higher than that if they can, but at a minimum, it's 1 foot above the 100-year floodplain. And that's what we mean when we say freeboard. The safe access rule is a rule that is not unique to the city of Austin, but it is one of those rules that is above the minimum standards. And the safe access rule says that you have to be able to, when you're developing in the floodplain, you have to build you have to develop the property such that you walk from the house to a point on the right-of-way, all at an elevation that's 1 foot above the floodplain. The purpose of that is so that we're not developing islands, a house that may be elevated up, but the occupants inside don't have safe access out, and first responders don't have safe access in. Now, the safe access rule is probably one of the most common that is difficult and in some cases impossible for people to meet. Because if your entire property and the street in front of your property is completely within the floodplain, and we're talking about the lower Onion Creek area and even some areas in the upper Onion Creek area, there's no way you can meet that rule. It's impossible. However, our land development code doesn't give staff the administrative ability to grant variances to that. So the only body that can do that is the city council. And we, not too often, maybe 6 to 7 times a year, take development applications to city council for floodplain variances, and sometimes those variances are to the safe access rule. The third floodplain regulation that I'll talk about is called no adverse impact. This is also another rule that is above the minimum standards. In the city of Austin, if somebody wants to develop in the floodplain, they have to prove that whatever they're developing is not going to cause increased flooding on other property. That makes perfect sense, right? We don't want somebody building something and then it causes higher elevations for their neighbor. So when we talk about no adverse impact in the city of Austin, we mean that there is a 0 rise in the floodplain level, 0. The FEMA minimum standards actually state there can be a 1-foot increase in the elevation because of the development. Again, it's one of those rules that we feel is very important because of the risks in our area where we wanted to be above the minimum standard, and so we go with the 0 rise. We call it a 0 rise rule for no adverse impact. Now, take for example, if there was an 1,100 square foot house and somebody wanted to demolish the house and put back an 1,100 square foot house in the essentially same footprint. That would not be an adverse impact because the house was there before, you're just putting back the exact same thing. Now, if you have an 1,100 square foot house and you want to build an 1,100 square foot addition on the first floor, now you're increasing the foundation area in the floodplain. You would have to hire a civil engineer to make sure that there's no adverse impact and submit that. If you wanted to do an 1,100 square foot addition on the second floor, then that's not an adverse impact because that's not impacting the floodplain itself. So again, those are the 3 main pieces of floodplain regulations that if you're substantially damaged, you have to be in compliance with. Now, talking about back to freeboard real quick, some of the homes in this lower Onion Creek area, in order to meet the freeboard requirement, would have to be elevated, in some cases up to 6 feet. Now, for a slab on grade foundation, that's not very feasible solution to actually elevate the entire foundation. The other option, or another option, is convert the first floor to parking and storage and then have the living space on the second floor. In some cases, there are 2-story houses that have some living space there, but again, I'm not saying that's that much more feasible, but that's just another way to meet the freeboard rule. Another way to bring the property into compliance is through a funded buyout program. We have 2 buyout programs essentially going on in the lower Onion Creek area. We have the core project area and then the program that the city council just allowed us to have funds for several weeks ago. And if you agree to a funded buyout program and the city then owns the property, then we demolish the house and it's in compliance because there's not a structure there anymore. Our goal in this lower Onion Creek area is to do buyouts, to remove people from the risk of flooding and bring the whole area into compliance. We don't have funding to do all that anymore right now, but we have some funds. In the Pinehurst area, there have been some engineering studies that have evaluated buyout options and some other alternatives, but we're not confident that the buyouts is the only option there. And so it's something that we need to we're putting into our budget for next fiscal year to determine what is the most feasible solution for that area. But again, our goal in this lower Indian Creek area for homes in the 100-year floodplain, our goal is to do buyouts. For the Halloween floods along Onion Creek in the city of Austin, there were about 750 homes that were flooded. We had a little over 400 of those were substantially damaged, about 55% of them. At this time, the city has money to buy about 60% of the substantially damaged homes. And that's through the core buyout program, and I call it the 25-year buyout program. It's indicated on these maps here to see that area. And then I recommend you go to the buyout session to learn more about it, about that there. So, what are the next steps? The next steps really depend on where your home is. If you're in the core buyout area, if you're in the 25-year buyout area, if you're in the 100-year in Lower Onion Creek, or if you're in Pinehurst. In the core area, again, the Corps has told us that they have funding for us. We're working on a contract with them. We're going to take that contract to council in August, and then that funding is going to come in. We don't have all the money for the core area right now, but we're confident that we're going to get all the money for the core to finish the core project. For the 25-year buyout area in Lower Onion Creek, on June 26th, City Council approved it's about $35.5 million for us to initiate buyouts on another 140 properties in the 25-year floodplain in the Lower Onion Creek area. We're finishing up some of the contracts to get that going, and then our real estate group will be contacting people to talk to them about that buyout program. If you're in the 100-year floodplain in Lower Indian Creek, we currently don't have funding for that area. But there is a budget item that will be considered by council, which they're considering in August and then voting on in September. That will include, that is an option for us to get funding to do the buyouts in the 100-year floodplain. Now, if that doesn't get passed, or if it gets passed in a different shape or form, another option that we have and we're pursuing is our grants. And we're applying for grants to get money to buy out homes in the 100-year floodplain that we don't currently have funding for.
In the Lower Onion Creek
In Lower Onion Creek.
only.
The buyout option at this time that we know is the only feasible solution is Lower Onion Creek. There's also an item in our budget for next fiscal year to reevaluate the Onion Creek floodplain study for the Pinehurst or Upper Onion Creek area to make the determination of what is the most feasible solution in that neighborhood. Is it buyouts? Is it maybe a combination of buyouts and maybe some another type of project like a levee or a flood wall or channel improvements? We need to identify what the most feasible solution is before we can say, okay, now we know the answer. We know it's a high priority. Here's how we're going to budget to get it done. If you are substantially damaged, your letter that your specific letter that you'll get that we mailed today, not this generic one, it's kind of tailored whether you're in the core area, 25-year, 100-year, or Pinehurst. If you're in the 100-year floodplain, then the letter states that by November 1st of 2015, not this year but next, you have to begin the process to bring it into compliance. Now that gives us 2 budget cycles for budget funding to find money to do buyouts, or gives us 2 years to find grants to do the buyouts. The 2 budget cycles was the key for us listing that date as the time where you have to begin compliance. Now, things may change from now until then, and we know that, and we'll be in contact with those folks to say, here's the status of the grants, here's the status of the funding. In the Pinehurst area, it's the same date, November 1st, 2015, to begin compliance, but at that point, we're confident that we're going to have the engineering piece of that study done to have an idea of what the solution is so that we can start finding funding for it. Again, things will change from now until then, and we'll be in contact with those folks to let them know what's going on. That is, it's a lot to handle. It's a lot of information, and the letters are, it's a lot of stuff to understand, and I know that. This was a brief discussion of it. When you get your letter, if you get your letter, if you're substantial, and you have questions, our phone number is on there. We want to talk to you about it.